Hello, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Having Challenging Conversations. My name is Jeremiah DeGullen from the Center for Professional and Executive Development. Before we get started, I want to turn things over briefly to Shannon Tim from the Wisconsin School of Business. Shannon?
Thanks, Jeremiah. My name is Shannon Tim. I'm the Director of Alumni Relations at the Wisconsin School of Business. It's great to be with everyone today. Thanks for tuning in. First, I want to thank Harry for being here and tackling this topic with us about how to have difficult conversations. I think that we can probably all agree that no matter what role you're in, communication in the workplace is vital, so I'm really looking forward to today's presentation. We can move to the next slide. Before we get started, I just want to share some other things that you might be interested in that we have coming up at the School of Business. So first is our Badger Executive Talk series, which has two upcoming speakers. If you're not familiar with this series, Dean Samba invites executives from our alumni community to have just a candid conversation about leadership and present-day business challenges that are going on in their industries. These events are virtual, so they're live streamed, but they also take live questions from viewers. So our next guest for that series is Jim Wuthrich, who's among our Hollywood Badgers. Jim is president of content distribution, at Warner Media, what's probably better known to you as Warner Brothers. There's just a ton of disruption happening in the media and entertainment business. So I think this conversation is going to be really interesting. Then on November 10th, we'll shift to the healthcare industry with Laura Francis, who is CEO of SI Bone. And they specialize in developing medical devices that help patients with back pain. Laura's played a fundamental role in this company, including bringing it public in 2018. So again, just another really interesting conversation. And then we're also excited that football is resuming on campus, and we'll be celebrating homecoming on October 30th. So we'll be hosting the homecoming bash tailgate at Granger Hall leading up to the game. And we also still have a few remaining football tickets that are available against Iowa. So if you're interested in any of these opportunities, you can visit business.wisc.edu/alumni, that URL that you see there on your screen for more information. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Jeremiah to get us started.
Thank you, Shannon. Today's webinar is also brought to you by the Wisconsin School of Business Center for Professional and Executive Development. CPED offers online and in-person programs and certificates that will give you modern, relevant skills needed to advance your career. All of our programs offer interactive learning sessions facilitated by instructors with practical business experience. CPED also partners with organizations to provide customized professional development programs, coaching, and consulting. For more information about CPED, please visit our website at uwcped.org. Do you want to advance the slide? If you have any questions you'd like to ask during today's webinar, you can submit those questions using the questions box in the GoToWebinar control panel. And you can expand or collapse the control panel using the orange arrow. We'll post questions that are submitted during the Q&A at the end of today's webinar. I also want to mention that today's webinar is being recorded, and a link to the recording and a copy of the presentation will be made available within the next few days. And now, I'd like to introduce today's facilitator, Harry Webne-Behrman. Harry has served as a facilitator, consultant, educator, and mediator for over 35 years and has worked with hundreds of businesses, schools, and community groups and public agencies, facilitating large deliberation and engagement processes, as well as mediating interpersonal disputes. In 2006, Harry received the Wisconsin Association of Mediators Distinguished Service Award in recognition of his extensive contributions to the field. He maintains a tremendous enthusiasm about the importance of learning to work collaboratively and to build positive work environments. Harry, thank you for joining us today. I'll pass things over to you.
Thank you, Jeremiah. Hi, everybody. It's great to be with you, and thank you for taking the time to join this webinar on having challenging conversations. I spent many years living in Wisconsin. I now live in Ottawa, Ontario, Canada, and continue this work here, but it's always a pleasure to work with UW and the UW School of Business and CPED to bring educational programs to adult learners. So what we're going to be doing today is focusing on the whole idea of having challenging conversations. And in framing it, I'm going to be pulling together resources from a few different books and articles and concepts that I encourage you to follow up. So I'll be introducing those to you, but hope that you do follow up both by reading more about it and feel free to contact me by email, and I'm happy to answer additional questions. So what will we learn today? A few core things. Those core elements of challenging conversations so we can approach them with greater clarity and confidence. We're going to have some strategies that are very practical, intended to be applied to our workplaces, whether those workplaces are in the traditional face-to-face or in the virtual environment. Understand specifically ways that communication, negotiation, conflict resolution, consensus building can be applied to those situations. And then not only think of ourselves as participants in these difficult conversations, but also as leaders potentially facilitating these conversations for others. So I hope that you walk away with these kinds of outcomes from our hour together. So to get us started, I want to understand a little bit more about you. Where are you challenged when you think about having challenging conversations? And this poll offers a few different options as a way to respond. Is it listening fully to others, asserting your own needs effectively, working through conflicts constructively, facilitating those kinds of conversations that need to happen within groups? Or are you approaching this saying, nah, I'm really pretty good at this? So Brooke, let's get a sense of the group. Just take a few more seconds to get people's responses. We have a pretty good sized group, so that's great. And from what I can see here, being able to assert your own needs effectively is an area that has a significant portion of responses. Also, working through conflict constructively, those seem to be the two highest areas. Sounds like people are pretty good at listening. That's not the primary area of challenge, so that's important to know. And then about a fifth of the group are finding that the key challenge is facilitating difficult group conversations. So this is helpful for me in being able to frame what we're going to be learning, to be able to understand where people are at in the group. So thanks for taking the time to respond to the poll question. So when we talk about challenging conversations, one way that we build from that is from a model known as the difficult conversations model. This came from Stone, Heen, and Patton, and the book Having Difficult Conversations is a good resource. One of the important contributions that they've made to our thinking here is to understand that there are actually three conversations that are going on simultaneously. There's the substantive conversation, the emotional conversation, and what they call the identity conversation. Let's get inside that. Substantive conversation is often what we identify as the topic of the issue. So if I, for example, am a manager and I'm going to a staff member and I'm saying, I really need you to work on this project and I need to have deliverables on this project by the end of the week, to me, substantively, this is about the deliverables. It's about the project. And you may well also, as the staff person, say, yeah, this is about the project. So that's our substantive aspect. Now, within the substantive conversation, however, there may be different ideas regarding what the scope is and really what's being asked for. So, for example, in a given project, I might say that I need A, B, and C, and you may take it that A is the most important, and that if I can get to B and C, then, or if you can get to B and C, then that'll be great, but I really need to deal with A. From my perspective, it may be that A is the first step, but I need to get to B, and I ultimately really need you to get to C. So if you give me something that covers A and B, but really hasn't spoken much to C yet, you might be feeling like, well, I got most of it done, and we've made a really good start, but I might be feeling like, wait a second, this is really just half-baked. This isn't done at all. You didn't really understand the issue. So substantively, we might even be having some different perspectives on how we've scoped the conversation. Emotionally, just to continue the same idea, it has to do with how we feel about the stuff. So, am I disappointed that you failed to deliver what I expected? Am I angry about it? Am I embarrassed because this incomplete project is now something I was counting on in terms of my being able to deliver something else to my colleagues or my superiors? Any of those things might be there. You might also feel embarrassed, disrespected, angry, upset with yourself. There are any number of possible feelings, but that emotional part of the conversation is a really important conversation that's going on. Sometimes the conversation is going on explicitly between the two people, but sometimes it's also going on in our heads. It might be that I'm going, oh, I really thought that Joe was going to understand what I was saying. I thought I was really clear here, and he didn't do that. So I'm really disappointed, and I wonder if I can trust him with future projects. Wow, I really am upset about this, and I don't know how I'm going to recover. Joe might also be feeling, wow, I'm really upset. I don't know that Harry is going to trust me with anything else anymore. I also really am angry with him because he wasn't clear with his instructions. So any of those things might be going on. So you've got two of the three conversations here. The third conversation is one that is often elusive, but frankly is often the most powerful. This is the identity conversation. This is the sense that I have regarding you and you have regarding me, and the safety, the trustworthiness, the integrity of my identity. If I am Joe in this case, the staff member, I might be concerned that Harry is going to tell other people that Joe is untrustworthy. He doesn't follow through. He doesn't finish up the work. My reputation is thus endangered. Similarly, Harry might be feeling like, oh, great, I'm going to look like a fool when I bring this half-finished product to the meeting, and that's going to be embarrassing for me. I need to get it all done. And then because I'm now feeling I need to get it all done myself, I might be angry or resentful at Joe. I thought I was going to have time to work on other things, or I'd have free time in the evening. Now I stay up late, etc. The thing that's important here is that when Joe and Harry ultimately have a conversation, that's the difficult conversation that follows up this disappointment, that difficult conversation needs to address all three of the sub-conversations. It needs to focus on not only the stuff, the substance, which is where we typically go, especially in business, but we also need to acknowledge and understand each other's feelings about the substance, not to turn it into a therapy session, but to be fully respectful of each other's perspectives in the situation and acknowledge and understand the emotional part of the conversation and understand this most vulnerable part, the identity piece. Sometimes this conversation really lurks beneath the surface. So to make it transparent and bring it out there for us to actually acknowledge and recognize can be an important element of what we're doing in a difficult conversation. When we have that conversation, it's crucial to speak from your own experience. This is how I experienced our interaction, rather than to presume or assume or analyze how the other person must have experienced it, or how people who are not in the room may be experiencing it. speak from your own experience. It's also really important when we have this conversation to be genuinely curious. Listen fully to the other person's story. Really try to understand where they're coming from. I recognize when I say this, that's easier said than done. So when we get inside this a little bit more, I'm going to offer a few specific strategies to pay attention to. So sometimes we think our intent is to be complimentary, to be positive. But sometimes the impact, the way it lands, may be different from what we intended. So I may well tell my dog, Obi, hey, you're a good dog. But his perspective may be, hey, it's never a great dog. That's going to be there with our colleagues, our family members. It can be there that way as well. So we need to be open to this difference between intent and impact as we approach these conversations, and recognize that while my intent may be to be respectful, it may still be landing in a way that's impacting you differently. So as we approach this, I'd like you to just take a moment to consider a specific situation. Recall a time when you had a difficult conversation with another person. In your mind's eye, what were some key aspects of that conversation? What'd you say? How'd you feel? What do you recall of what the other person said or how she or he felt? How well did you understand one another? And what was the result? By the way, this may be a conversation that happened yesterday. Maybe a conversation that sticks in your mind from a year ago. Doesn't matter. Whatever's coming into mind. And then as you think about this conversation, consider, in terms of those three conversations, what now stands out in your memory? So just ask you to reflect on that for a moment. And as you're so inclined to share comments, share some comments in the questions area, chat area. We'll move on. But one of the things that I've asked Jeremiah to do is that as he notices these things, he might bring those to our attention, because it might actually bring a question up that's relevant to where we are in the presentation rather than waiting necessarily for the end of the hour. So another resource that's really helpful for thinking about challenging conversations is a book that's called Crucial Conversations, Tools for Talking When Stakes Are High by Patterson, Grenny, McMillan, and Switzler. A crucial conversation is similar to a difficult conversation, but it's one where it's inherently where the stakes are high, the perspectives will vary, emotions run high, and the outcomes matter. Emotions run high, and the outcomes matter. So when we think about these crucial conversations, we can't avoid them. We'd like to. They're going to be uncomfortable, but they're really important to deal with. So we need to take into account those three conversations, but we also need to take into account that as we approach it, we should anticipate very different perspectives and emotions that will run strong. So the model that we'll use for being able to talk through challenging conversations is intended to not only deal with any difficult conversation, but especially those crucial ones where the outcomes really matter and we can anticipate that the emotions run high. The starting point, and what I infer from the poll may well be a point of greatest strength for our audience, is listening. A wonderful resource around this idea is a guy named Edgar Schein. I imagine many of you, especially since you're from the business school alumni, have heard of him because he is a veteran business organizational development guru who has provided many contributions through the years. You may or may not be aware that in the past decade, he, along with his son, has developed what he calls a humble inquiry model of listening for leaders. And the books Humble Inquiry, Humble Leadership, and Humble Consulting are all resources that speak about this. He invites us to not just listen for the sake of showing in a good form kind of way, oh, I'm listening to you, but in a genuinely humble and curious way as a leader to invite people to speak to you about the things that matter. And it means that I need to get myself prepared to have this conversation. Need to be able to show genuine openness, curiosity, and empathy to the other person so that I'm deeply listening and using the usual skills and tools for doing so, like restating what the other person's telling you, reflecting their feelings, clarifying for deeper understanding, summarizing. All of that is there, but it goes further. It stays open to say, let's resist forming judgments. Let's be open and curious about the value of the story that's being shared and really acknowledge and validate what is the core story. And the core story, if we can go back to those 3 conversations, may not be substantive. It may well be emotional or identity or some combination of them. So if I'm going to truly understand your perspective as we approach this very challenging conversation, I need to start with a listening stance in which I'm showing genuine humility, curiosity, and demonstrating through all of my actions respect for you and your perspective. This is not the same as agreement, but if I demonstrate this ability to listen well and show my own vulnerability by that curiosity, then it gives me greater standing with you, just as a practical matter, when I say, this is my perspective, I'd like to share it with you. So it's a paradox here. I'm asking you to start this conversation by preparing yourself to fully and deeply and humbly inquire and listen to the other person. In combination with being able to understand your needs, I need to assert mine. And for many of you, this was an area that you identified earlier as an area of challenge. Assertive communication can be contrasted to aggressive communication, where I'm letting you know what I need, all right, but I'm doing so without necessarily respecting you. Or submissive, sometimes called passive communication, where I'm pretty vague, pretty unclear, uncertain about what it is I have to say, and maybe I even dance around it. An example, if I were to come to you and say, Joe, I expected that project, I expected it by Friday, and it's already Thursday afternoon, and I'm not seeing anything. What the hell's going on here? That would be an example of aggressive communication. Now, I might feel justified in some way to be really clear and stern and specific. I might even call it, tough love, that I'm being so firm and stern. But the natural consequence of using aggressive communication is that the other person, if Joe complies, is only going to do so out of fear, and it'll be minimal compliance. It's also quite possible that Joe will escalate and get defensive. It's also quite possible that Joe withdraws and doesn't really tell me anything about what's going on. So while I might use aggressive communication with the intent of getting Joe to comply with what I need, my impact is likely to sabotage that. On the other hand, if I use submissive, passive communication, then I'm vague. I might just dance around it. I might just check in, say, hey, Joe, How's it going? Wow, hot day today, isn't it? You need any help around that project that we've got coming due tomorrow? Well, yeah, well, if you've got an issue, then you can always, drop me a note or send me a text and we can see if we can touch base. Now, even in that situation, I've mentioned that I care about the project, but I've not been specific about my concerns, have I? I've not really let Joe know this is what I'm uncomfortable, this is what I'm upset about or anxious about or otherwise having my feelings about. If I communicate assertively instead, then I'm clear, specific, and I'll focus on specific desired outcomes together. So I might go to Joe and say, Joe, I need to check in with you about the project that's due tomorrow. Do you have a minute? So I've also checked to see if he's available. I haven't seen anything from you yet. Are you making progress? Can you let me know what you're up to? And then I can listen. So hand in hand, I can hear if Joe is concerned, right? I can be going back to the listening mode, and I can move on to say, look, Joe, I need to make sure that I have this by end of day tomorrow. And if you have anything that you can send to me by end of day today so I can begin to get a sense of it, that would be helpful, just for example. And Joe can say, well, this will work or that, or this is where he needs help, or something unanticipated showed up. Whatever it is that Joe needs to say, I've invited him to be able to express it by approaching him in a clear, specific, assertive manner, and then combining that with listening. I also need to leave the conversation with some clarity together. What are our desired outcomes? And again, those might be substantive, emotional, or identity. Any of those three conversations. Need to also understand our Bhatna, Watna, Malatna. Best, worst, and most likely alternative to a negotiated agreement. We'll talk about this a little bit more. But if we're not able to figure it out together, we need to figure out what our options are. Sometimes an assertive message is benefited by an I message as a place to start, where I express I feel a certain way when you behave in another way because it has these natural outcomes. Sometimes this is a way of framing it that can have a way of us being able to say, okay, this is what I want to say, and I wasn't sure how to say it. But assertive communication is much more than just an I message. Fundamental to assertive communication as well, continue to listen with respect. They go back and forth in what Robert Bolton years ago in his book, People Skills, called yin-yang communication. You can reasonably expect that we're going to have to go back and forth 3 or 4 times just in order to come to an understanding of our agenda. And it's at that point that we're clear about where problem-solving skills and strategies need to enter. And we also need to keep in mind that since so much information is often misunderstood, let's normalize it. Let's bring greater clarity to the discussion, both through specific assertive points and agreements and by documenting the conversation so that as a result, we're able to see from the notes, oh, this is what is the outcome. These are the next steps. These are the deliverable dates, etc.
Hey, Harry, we had a quick question here.
Sure, Jeremiah, that's great.
One of our attendees asked, what if while listening, the other person states a false fact? Should that be corrected or not?
So if at this point early on, when I'm listening to you, I want to understand your perspective. So when it's my turn, not at the point that you're speaking, but when it's my turn, I'll say, I have a disagreement with you regarding what you identified earlier. You said that we had made an agreement to do A and B at this point, and C was going to be a likely outcome if we could get there. My recollection is that we said A, B, and C, that all of them needed to be done. It may also be a matter of fact in the way in which you're implying it, and the questioner is implying it, where somebody says, this is a sequence of events, and this is how it happened, and this is how it all came down. We need to be careful to understand the difference between a fact and the interpretation of the fact, the meaning of the fact. And I can still respectfully disagree with your meaning and assert that. And at the same time, we may even have some differences regarding which facts are relevant. So I hope that begins to speak to your question, but early on, just to get back to the Cliff Notes version of it, early on, I need to really make sure I'm demonstrating to you that I'm understanding your perspective. That's what's powerful. And that perspective includes not only your ideas, but also how you feel about it. Thanks for the question. So this actually gets at something that's going to be crucial when we think about what it needs to be negotiated. I have never found an exception to what I'm about to tell you. And it's framed here in terms of a conflict, but it's just a challenging conversation, not inherently a conflict. There are always three kinds of needs to be negotiated: substantive needs, procedural needs, and relational needs, sometimes called psychological needs. The substantive needs, you'll see, actually relate very well back to those three conversations about stuff. It's the stuff that we're discussing, typical definition of the conversation. Procedural needs have to do with the process by which we're discussing the stuff. What are our expectations for how the stuff will be discussed? We may have very different ideas around that, so it's important to negotiate an agreement regarding what we both see as fair and understood procedures for how we're going to address the substance. Sometimes these are called operating agreements. They're elements of project charters. In much of the work I do, we simply call it ground rules. It can be what are assumed to be by many of us to be normal protocols, such as one person will speak at a time. We will try not to interrupt one another. We'll resist name calling or interruption or forming premature judgments. There are some things like that that we try to do. It's also important that when people make a statement like, I want this to be a respectful conversation, that we operationalize that in terms of behavior. What do you mean by respect? What do I mean by respect? What is our common understanding of what is disrespectful? Similarly, you might have some clarity regarding confidentiality. Who needs to know and understand the stuff that we're discussing? So you have substantive needs to negotiate, your procedural needs, and you also have the relational needs. Relational needs are indicated by terms like trust, honesty, safety, security, integrity, ethics. All of those relate to this relational set of needs. And I may feel like, yeah, this is an important issue. I want to be able to work on it, but I don't trust you. Or going back to the question about the facts, I don't expect you to be honest. Well, in a lot of ways, the relational needs are going to be really crucial as a basis for addressing the substantive needs. All three kinds of needs are present in every challenging conversation. They are framed differently by the different people. They're weighted differently, but they're always there. But if we're going to get to the core issues of the conversation, we need to recognize all three kinds of needs. This gets at another concept that's important here, which is that often we argue or negotiate from a position saying, I want A, B, and C. And the other person says, you can have C, I'm not giving you A and B. Those are positions. That's what I want. The important thing now is why I want it. The deeper why relates to those needs in negotiation we were just talking about. Why do I care about this substance? Why do I care about this process? Why do I care about the relational security that we are dealing with? Those things need to be our focus. So as we have this conversation, we need to be able to do so, moving from positions, why I want it, into, I'm sorry, what I want, to interests, the deeper why I want it. All of this sets the stage for the process of having this conversation and negotiating through to the other side where we reach agreements collaboratively. Remember, I earlier said as well that my intent is not just for you to think of this in terms of a conversation that you're having with another person, but also where you're facilitating that in a group. And since several of you identified that as the key challenge here, I want to make sure that we're framing it that way as well. So collaborative negotiation, sometimes called interest-based negotiation, is one that focuses on the underlying needs, interests, and concerns that we were just discussing towards the development of mutually satisfying solutions. That's key, mutually satisfying solutions. Collaborative negotiation means that when we get together, we can really get at the key issues that are present to have this in this challenging conversation. So where do we begin? Well, earlier I told you, you actually need to begin by preparing yourself to listen. So when I do so, it means I take any of the learning that I've had from mindfulness, meditation, body work, whatever you've learned in order to center yourself and prepare yourself to listen. I generally like to sit like this. Take a nice deep breath, anchor myself in the ground, and prepare myself to listen to the other person. If I'm coming to the conversation from something else, or if I'm surprised by this challenging conversation coming up, then I need to make sure I take that moment to prepare myself to listen. I also need to remind myself of my intention. My intention is to be curious and open to discover your perspective. If I'm facilitating this conversation with others, then I need to bring this presence to the group so they actually see a model of it and they hear my words and speaking about the intention that we have to really have a meaningful conversation. That's all at the beginning. And then as I begin it, I really need to listen for those underlying interests and needs, the real issues. Recall what we said earlier about the 3 conversations. So we're thinking about what it is that really needs to be discussed. If I've prepared for the discussion, then I bring a couple of different issues with me. But if I were to come in with A, B, C, D, E, F, G, that's overwhelming. But if I have narrowed it down to a couple of things that are the important things that I feel are there to discuss, then I'm also leaving lots of room in the construction of the agenda to you for you to share. This is what you feel you need to discuss. And they may be similar, but they may also be different. As you have the conversation, remember what I said earlier about speaking from your own experience. Take one issue at a time. Try to break it down so that it's understood and the other person isn't overwhelmed. Similarly, if the other person is going on and on and on, it's totally fair, legitimate, important, in service to our challenging conversation for you to say, excuse me, Joe, I need a moment here. You have a whole lot that you're telling me. It's very powerful and clearly very important. I want to make sure that I'm understanding it. Can I summarize back to you what I'm hearing? That's not an interruption in the sense of cutting someone off. It's an intervention in the sense that we're intervening in the conversation in service to our deeper mutual understanding of the issues. Try to do that clearly, assertively, and with the lightest touch necessary in order to get the 2 of you on the same page in terms of sharing the airspace sharing the agenda, sharing the conversation. As you come up with issues that you're trying to problem solve around, generate several possible solutions. This is as we would in any problem solving. If we only offer one idea, and then from that one idea, we say, oh yeah, that's it, let's go for it. It might be satisfactory, but it's terribly unlikely to be the optimal solution. It might also be that if one idea is offered and the other person says, oh no, that won't work because, well, that judgment has what's called a chilling effect on future negotiation. We stop generating ideas. So even though there's a lot of discomfort here, it's really important to generate several ideas and then clarify criteria. What's important here? How are we evaluating the fitness of a given solution? Is it something that costs the least? Does it benefit the most people? Does it fix the issue quickly? Or is it sustainable? Any of these are perfectly acceptable criteria, but we need to be clear together what criteria are we using. And while we may not have entered the conversation with the same criteria for evaluating these solutions, we at this point need to at the very least have mutually acceptable criteria by which we're now able to say, this will resolve it, or at least this is worth testing. The solution may not be the final answer. The solution may be a pilot project that we try out or a pilot effort that we then implement in order to test it and say, this is working pretty well. Let's go further. There are any number of possibilities here. The key is for me to stay flexible and optimistic about solutions. And if I can stay calm and patient in the face of the tough sledding that we might be going through, then that's more inclined to encourage you to hang in there and stay with the conversation as well. If we're to apply this to groups, then we also have a situation where we need to understand it a little bit with a little greater complexity. What are those underlying needs and interests, the real issues? Well, different members of the group may have what we sometimes refer to as different agendas. Well, it may be beneficial beforehand, if at all possible, for me to check in with each individual before the meeting in order to understand what are their needs, interests, and concerns. What do they see as the challenging conversation we need to have? If I've done that, then I'm able to map out, as it were, the kinds of issues that are emerging and the pockets of people who have those as primary issues. If I come into the meeting unsure, unclear, unaware of what the broader set of concerns are, then that can be a surprise for one, and for another, it can overwhelm the time that we have. It helps me craft an agenda, or at least propose one, that will really respond to the issues that people are discussing. Again, with a group, you want to make sure that we stay focused on that one issue at a time and make sure it's understandable. If you were to give people an overwhelming question that is just scoped too broadly, you'll get a whole lot of glazed eyes and people saying, I don't know where to begin. You might even get, silence in terms of the response. You also, in doing so, allow those who might be the few who feel the most strongly, the most passionately about an issue to dominate the conversation. What we want to be able to do in these challenging conversations is give voice not only to those who feel most passionately or who speak loudest in the group or who may have position power or other standing within the group to speak. We need to make sure that those voices that we may not hear from as often, those that might be more reticent, maybe it's from people who have less position power within the organization, maybe people who are junior within the experience of a veteran group, or for that matter, even folks who tend to be more introverted rather than extroverted. We need to make sure that we're giving space to all of those voices. So this is the basic model that I like to take to these conversations, whereby as a result, we are then able to say, okay, what are the agreements that we've come to? And if we can document those agreements and we're able to then come to a greater clarity about how they're going to be implemented and how they're going to be assessed, then the challenging conversation can actually be a springboard for deeper understanding and awareness than we may have ever imagined prior to having it. I realize so often we have a tendency to want to avoid these challenging conversations. But my invitation to you is that if you approach it by listening well, being open, asserting your own needs clearly, specifically, and then, as I was just beginning to outline in terms of negotiation here, that we're really trying to focus on those underlying interests, then I think you have a whole lot of opportunity to be successful. So with that, let's check in about the circumstances where you are most challenged so that we can speak to a couple of those with the remaining time that we have. So there are a few options here: expressing concerns to those in power, confronting peers where I disagree strongly, raising taboo subjects and undiscussables, and speaking with someone who might respond aggressively, or another. Where are you, under what circumstances are you most challenged? Thank you, Brooke. So as you're completing those, I just want to anecdotally note that I'm used to interacting with people a bit more throughout the hour, in the sense that there would be breakout discussions, other kinds of interactive exercises, etc. The course that I teach for CPED, Project Leadership Communication, takes some of the ideas that we've been working on, as well as others, and specifically for project managers and other leaders, and really focuses on the essential communication, conflict resolution, and negotiation skills that are required. So if you're wanting to work more and have more interaction, I invite you to look on the CPED site and learn more about that course. So what do we have here? Oh, it looks like the largest area is speaking with someone who might respond aggressively. Okay, but each of the other areas also got some play. So okay, very good. Thank you. So let's start at the bottom then and work our way up. So one of the concerns that we have frequently in approaching these challenging conversations is that the other person may well respond aggressively. So I tell Joe, I'm really disappointed that he hasn't finished the project. And Joe's response is, who the hell are you to tell me this? Or something along those lines. And he gets in my face and he's really upset and angry that I've confronted him about the work. Now, I wish that I could have someone to actually role play this with right now, because I think that would be a little bit more powerful, but let me just try to do this myself. If my response to Joe is, oh, whatever you want, Joe, I didn't mean to upset you, then am I getting my needs met? No, that's submissive. If I escalate in return aggressively, then that's going to be problematic. That's what becomes then a conflict escalator. And then this difficult conversation that we were going to have has now essentially become a shouting match. But if I respond first with listening and curiosity, that can be very powerful. Whoa, Joe, let me just take a step back and understand what you're saying here. It sounds like you're feeling really strongly that I brought this concern to you. And it feels like you're pretty angry that I'm bringing it up. Is that right? Well, you bet it's right, Harry. I can't believe you're doing this. The thing's not due till tomorrow. Tomorrow, you can't talk to me about it till tomorrow. Okay, so what you're saying is that you feel like for us to have any conversation about it before tomorrow really is kind of getting in your space. Is that right? Yeah, that's right. Now notice that when I responded that way, I'm maintaining calm. I'm acknowledging his feelings. And at this point, he's feeling like, yeah, I understood it. It wouldn't be uncommon for Joe at that point to say, I'm sorry I responded so strongly. Wouldn't be uncommon. But even if he doesn't, it still gives me space now to be able to say, Joe, here's why I'm bringing it up right now. I know the project's not due till tomorrow afternoon. However, I've not seen any information from you, and I was growing concerned. Are you telling me that I have no reason to have any concern? So I'm telling him what my concern is, and I'm posing a question. We might still be able to negotiate what I need, which is that, gosh, if he's got some stuff done by the end of today, I'd love to see it. But it might also be that we find that we have other things, because it wasn't just about the substance, remember? It was about identity. I wasn't trusting him, I wasn't respecting him, and he had a very strong emotional response. So I hope that begins to speak to that fourth question. I want to just very quickly speak to the other ones, and then I'll turn it over for other questions. Expressing concerns to those in power, we tend to simplify this notion of power as being position power. I want you to recognize that it's not just about people who have position power over us, superordinate, subordinate, but also that there are lots of different sources or bases of power within an organization or within a relationship. There's expertise, there's the referent power of one's present, there's the power that exists from being able to know the organization and the ins and outs of how to get things done. They need you, if they're the big cheese, they need you just as much as you may need their approval. So being able to express those concerns, yes, it makes you vulnerable. I'm not quite sure what I'm doing here. And yet at the same time, the honesty, the integrity, the transparency around setting an agenda for a conversation we need to have is something that is really important if we're going to solve that issue. And they need to solve it too, and they need to know about it. If you bring it forward, that brings it forward for them. Where you have peers, where there's strong disagreement, sometimes that can be really uncomfortable. So we need to find ways to make it face-saving. And again, being assertive, listening well, and possibly having conversations that are offline, not in front of others, so that that face-saving is even enhanced. And then finally, around raising taboo subjects and undiscussables, there's so many organizations where we just don't talk about something because it's politically not okay to do so. And my invitation to you is to consider that Bhatna, Ratna, Malatna. What are your alternatives if we don't discuss this issue? What will we just skate along in the same way of mediocrity, or will things actually go off ledge and be worse, or will it resolve itself without our discussing it? I think being able to look at your alternatives is an important way of defining that negotiation space and deciding whether this challenging conversation is one that's worth having. So I want to invite you to post any additional questions or comments. And as you do so, Jeremiah is going to be receiving those, and he'll be bringing them forward to me. As those are coming in, I just want to, just one thing I just want to mention too. There's my email address, my phone number. I encourage you first to follow up by email. That's generally a good way for us to be able to establish a time to talk. And since I live in Canada and many of you don't necessarily have the North American plan, I don't mind calling you after we've set it all up. Thanks. Jeremiah?
Thanks, Harry. That was great. As Harry mentioned, we're going to open it up for questions now. Again, you can submit your questions using the questions box from the side of the box on the sidebar, and you can expand or collapse that sidebar using the orange arrow in case you had done that earlier. While we give folks a chance to submit their questions, I did have a question for you, Harry. How do you engage in a conversation with somebody that doesn't want to talk to you?
And again, these are often uncomfortable, challenging conversations, right? So it's not uncommon for it to be a situation where someone else doesn't necessarily want to talk. I need to hear their initial response. So if I approach you, Jeremiah, and I say, Jeremiah, there's a difficult topic that I think is important for us to discuss, and I'd really like to talk about it now. And your response is, no, Harry, I don't want to talk about it. Then I need to be curious. And Jeremiah, if you can just play with me for a moment. Help me understand, Jeremiah, why don't you want to talk about it now? And just make it up, Jeremiah.
I don't have time, Harry. I just don't have time.
Okay, so you don't have time right now, but I hope you can acknowledge that this is an important topic. Can we agree to get together on Monday to discuss it?
Yeah, that sounds like a doable plan.
And that may or may not be it, okay? And it may also be that it's not about time, but it's about as we get into the conversation, your response is, this is really making me uncomfortable, Harry. I don't really want to talk anymore. To which I might then say, well, Jeremiah, I hear you saying this is really uncomfortable right now. And I'll be honest with you, this is uncomfortable for me too. And if I were to have my druthers, we wouldn't necessarily have to have this conversation, but I think we both agree this is a crucial issue. How might we make this conversation one that you're feeling like you want to hang in there and continue? So if I continue with that and I keep you engaged in that way, then there's at least a chance that even if we take a break right now, we have an agreement that we'll continue talking.
Thank you, Harry. One of our participants asked, are there any general guidelines for dealing with gender, racial, or generational differences among those involved in the discussion?
Oh, I think that's a really great question, and a question that would give us a couple of hours more. My initial reaction to that is that I need to keep in mind what I said earlier about intent and impact. If we're always staying focused on trying to understand the impact of what I'm saying to you across generations or across gender or racial ethnic groups, then that helps us understand together what guidelines we need. I should also start from the curiosity, and this gets at establishing the ground rules at the beginning, the curiosity that I have as to how we each define a respectful conversation space. So it may be that I think of a respectful conversation in a certain way, so my intent is for that to be the way to do it, but you have a different take on that. One other thing just to mention briefly is that across generations, we have very different modes of communication as well. And so I might find communicating and having this conversation by text to be something that I would personally find really uncomfortable and incomplete. And one of my sons or daughters might say, I can have this conversation in that mode just fine. One of the negotiations is what mode of communication will we both find mutually acceptable in order to have the conversation. So we need to stay open in establishing the ground rules, kind of move this conversation upstream a little bit, how we're going to have the conversation as we approach it, and then keep in mind intent and impact throughout, and keep on checking in, keep doing pulse checks in the conversation. How are we honoring our ground rules?
Thank you, Harry. And we have time for one last question here from the audience. How do we ensure resolution in the discussion? So the question specifically is, what if the other party believes the issue has been resolved and therefore doesn't want to talk anymore, and the other does not believe it was even close to being resolved?
Yeah, so I appreciate this question. One thing I did not include in the slides, and perhaps I should have, was something that I have that's called Hallmarks of a Good Agreement. And I invite any of you who are interested in this to email me, and I'm glad to send that to you, as well as a little more information than we were able to cover in this brief amount of time. But the hallmarks of a good agreement include fairness. Okay, so each person involved sees it as fair, so they need to be able to acknowledge, yes, I feel this is a fair agreement, understanding how subjective that can be. Another is balance. A good agreement is balanced so that everybody has skin in the game, as it were, in terms of making it happen. A good agreement is specific enough to be actionable, right? We talk about actionable kinds of agreements all the time. A good agreement is specific enough to be actionable. Realistic, so we might even test it in terms of its realism. So before we end the conversation, we say we're agreeing to do this. Let's test that out. How does that work in the office on Friday? So we're doing that. A good agreement is also one that responded to the issues, the concerns that got raised at the beginning of the conversation. So we might even go back and say, did this agreement solve our issues? Or do we need another conversation? And then finally, a good agreement is future oriented. It doesn't just anticipate or react or respond to what we were now finding was challenging, but we're anticipating that in the future, even in normal, healthy relationships, there will be other challenging conversations. I also strongly encourage people to build in some kind of a check back mechanism. So we'll check back with each other in a few days, see how it's going.
Thank you, Harry. And thank you so much for your time today and sharing your expertise with us. We really appreciate it.